In the talk at Moby Dickens' bookstore, Forrest gave a piece of advice to those serious about looking for where he hid his treasure chest. Forrest advised searchers to read the book slowly and look for little abstract things that might catch up in their brain and lead to a hint. Forrest referred to these little abstract things as aberrations. For every aberration, or potential hint, I started with the possibility that what I was looking at was not a hint at all. That was always the first possibility. Maybe a certain aberration was just a marketing tool that Forrest used. Or maybe Forrest just liked how a phrase sounded. In my search, an aberration was just an aberration until proven otherwise. If I was determined to investigate a potential hint, the first and most important thing I did was to get myself into the correct frame of mind. I wasn't looking for the correct interpretation for potential hints. I was looking for all possible interpretations. And the first possible interpretation was always that the aberration was not a hint at all. No matter how silly an interpretation of a potential hint sounded, I wrote it down. I wasn't looking for the correct interpretation. I was looking for all possible interpretations. Thinking that I had the correct interpretation of a hint before I was holding the treasure chest was a risk that I was not willing to take. Picking one interpretation and discarding the rest might result in tossing away useful information. There was also the possibility that Forrest hid a single hint within multiple aberrations. In that case, no single decoded aberration would result in the answer. It would be impossible to piece together a hint without all the pieces. I couldn't risk throwing away a potential part of a puzzle just because an interpretation for that part did not make sense at the time it was discovered. Until I had the hint in hand, every interpretation was valid. There are 9 clues in Forrest's poem, and a hint could apply to any of them. A hint could also apply to a general area, a river, a road, a state, a named place, or dozens of other possibilities, both known and unknown to me. Different interpretations of a potential hint might lead to any one of those possibilities. It was critical, therefore, not to hobble a hint by tying it to somewhere it didn't belong, and I couldn't be sure where it belonged until after the solution was complete. There was one other possibility concerning the meaning of a hint. A hint might not have anything to do with the location of the treasure chest at all. It might be pointing to the reason Forrest hid the chest in the first place. I will admit to one bias I had when analyzing potential hints from Forrest. I always preferred subtle over obvious interpretations. I would rather have to work for the hint. I would make a note of the obvious interpretations, but I would keep looking for interpretations that were flying just under the radar. Early on in my search, before I had even obtained Forrest's memoir, The Thrill of the Chase, I noticed a critical problem that revolved around the hints. Throughout the hunt for Forrest's treasure chest, searchers were divided between New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. One of the things these searchers had in common was that each was overwhelmingly confident in both their solution and their search area, even though most of them weren't even in the correct state. This is not a jab against other searchers. You didn't have to know where Forrest hid his treasure in order to know that most searchers were looking in the wrong state. If the treasure was hidden in one of the 4 search states, then every searcher in every other state was not in the correct state. Seeing so many searchers so confident about search areas that were nowhere near each other, and so confident about solutions that had nothing at all in common, was fascinating to me. Most searchers were looking hundreds of miles away from the nearest clue, but everyone was so very confident. Why was that? Could there really be that many quality solutions to Forrest's poem scattered across the Rocky Mountains? I didn't think so. When I started my search, I saw this situation as a problem that I had to overcome, or else be at risk for falling into the same trap. I approached that problem in a number of ways. What I want to talk about in this video are the hints. The hints, or potential hints, were what I believed was the primary source of the problem. They were the reason that searchers were both divided and confident at the same time. Forrest wrote a lot of stories about a lot of subjects, and all of Forrest's stories had very colorful language that could be interpreted in countless ways. Knowing that Forrest included hints in his books and elsewhere, but not knowing which of Forrest's words contained those hints, meant that anything and everything that Forrest wrote and said was a potential hint. For example, consider trees. Forrest often mentioned cottonwood trees in his writings. Forrest also had a dog named Tsuke. The definition of Tsuke is village of the narrow place of the cottonwood trees. If a searcher's solution passed anywhere near cottonwood trees or Tsuke, New Mexico, you can bet that these cottonwood connections would be offered as support for that solution. If there weren't any cottonwood trees around, maybe there were lodgepole pines. If not lodgepole pines, then willow trees. If not willows, then box elders. If not box elders, then pinyon pines. Forrest had stories about all of them. Any of these trees that could be used by searchers to support their solution would be used by searchers to support their solution. Any of these trees that could not be used to support a solution were ignored. Pinyon pines illustrate this point the best. Some searchers used the presence of pinyon pines to support their solution. Other searchers used the absence of pinyon pines to support their solution. I always wondered if any searcher ever switched from the presence of pinyon pines to the absence of pinyon pines as their solution changed. To be fair, not all searchers fell for this trap. Another example is with supposed hints that point to one of the 4 search states. For example, Forrest wrote about a lapis lazuli sky in one of his stories. Lapis lazuli is a deep blue semi-precious stone. Within the 4 search states, lapis lazuli can only be found in Colorado. That fact was used as support for searchers with Colorado solutions. The meadowlark, on the other hand, is the state bird of both Wyoming and Montana. So when Forrest wrote about hunting meadowlarks as a boy for his family's dinner, searchers with solutions in Wyoming and Montana used this reference to support their solution. Colorado searchers ignored the meadowlark reference, and Wyoming and Montana searchers ignored the lapis lazuli reference. New Mexico searchers ignored both. The thinking seemed to be, if it supports my solution, it's a hint. If it does not support my solution, it's not a hint. Again, though, not all searchers were subject to these biases. Sometimes, instead of the potential hints being used to confirm a location, they instead directed searchers to a location. When Forrest talked about the little Popo-Aggie River near Lander, Wyoming, searchers swarmed to that area, thinking the chest must have been hidden nearby. When Forrest spoke of hauling heavy loads of lodgepole pine trees across Hebgen Lake in Montana, that made Hebgen Lake the new hotspot. In his book, Too Far to Walk, Forrest talked about bathing near the Ojo Caliente hot spring in Yellowstone. Some searchers were certain this meant that Ojo Caliente in Yellowstone was where warm waters halt. Other searchers were just as certain that Forrest was hinting at the spring of the same name in New Mexico. When Forrest wrote about Amelia Earhart, searchers speculated on Kerwin, Wyoming, where Earhart was building a summer cabin. When Forrest wrote about the car ride between Shoshone and Casper, Wyoming, with his brother Skippy, and about stopping somewhere between the two, searchers flooded the nearby Hell's Half Acre. The same thing happened when Forrest talked about Yellowstone, or West Yellowstone, or Earthquake Lake, or Gardner, or Matitsi, or Cody, or Taos, or hundreds of other locations. It even happened when Forrest talked about San Lazaro Pueblo, even though San Lazaro Pueblo is south of Santa Fe, and Forrest, from day one, said the treasure was located north of Santa Fe. All of the references to these locations may have been hints, but they did not necessarily have to be hints to where the treasure was hidden. The longer the treasure remained hidden, the more likely this was to be true. Most interpretations of the potential hints that I've seen are somewhat sketchy and not convincing, but many interpretations were perfectly reasonable. For instance, in the chapter Looking for Lewis and Clark, Forrest wrote about taking a trip up Red Canyon above Hebgen Lake with his friend Donnie. Later, in the chapter Tea with Olga, Forrest mentions drinking red, black, and green tea in that order. If you take the colors red, black, and green in that order and match them to resistors' color codes, you come up with the number 205. And it so happens that trail number 205 is the Red Canyon Creek Trail where Forrest said his trip started. Note that Forrest traveled up that trail on a horse named Lightning. This possible reference to electricity supports the resistor color code interpretation. Thinking that the Tea with Olga chapter might be reinforcing the Looking for Lewis and Clark chapter about going up trail number 205 was a legitimate interpretation of a potential hint. That does not mean that this is the correct interpretation. It just means that it is a legitimate and, in my opinion, a high-quality interpretation. To reiterate that point, just because a given interpretation of a potential hint makes a lot of sense does not mean that it is the correct interpretation. Throughout my search, I found several potential hints with multiple high-quality interpretations, not all of which could be correct at the same time. A couple weeks before uploading this video, I made a short video about the word indulgence. In case you don't know, Forrest gave his treasure chest a name. He first named it Tarzan, but then later changed the name to Indulgence. Recalling Forrest's advice to look for little abstract things that might catch up in your brain and lead to a hint, Tarzan and Indulgence are right up there as things that caught up in my brain. Why did Forrest give his treasure chest a name at all? Why Indulgence? Why Tarzan? 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 Really, Forrest? I'm surprised that no one questioned Forrest on the name Tarzan. If they did, I never saw it. I am certain that there are at least two hints involved with these names. The question is, how does one correctly interpret the potential hint without getting sidetracked by an incorrect interpretation? In my indulgence video, I give one interpretation for the word indulgence. I imply that it has to do with the phrase elbow room, which is a synonym of indulgence. I then show how this can be matched to stories in The Thrill of the Chase and provide a hint to, or a confirmation of, a solution. The elbow room interpretation is, in my opinion, perfectly reasonable. It may or may not be correct. That's not my point. My point is that it is a reasonable interpretation of a potential hint. But the problem with reasonable or even correct interpretations for hints is that they can still lead to an incorrect solution. For my indulgence video, two different searchers believe that the elbow room interpretation supports their two wildly different solutions. and both of those searchers are correct. The elbow room interpretation supports both solutions equally well. But even if the elbow room interpretation of indulgence is correct, at most, only one of those searchers' solutions is correct. And this is an example for a reasonable interpretation of a potential hint. Most of the interpretations for hints that I've seen don't rate high on my reasonableness scale. With the word indulgence alone, I would be willing to bet that I could match that word to every solution that has ever been conceived, and that's for just one word. Throw a dart at a map, and you can manipulate Forrest's words into supposed hints that fit wherever the dart landed, even if you miss the map. Forrest's stories could be interpreted to take a searcher anywhere they wanted to go, or to support any solution a searcher already had in mind. Yet another example is a potential hint from Forrest's memoir, Once Upon a While. On page 4, Forrest talks of singing the opera O Sole Mio while washing dishes as a child. I used this story to make a video entitled O Sole Mio. In the video, I show the lyrics to the song translated from Italian to English. There's a potential hint hidden within those lyrics. Specifically, the lyrics, "My sunshine, oh sunshine of mine, it is your face, it is your face." This can be translated further as, oh blaze of mine, it is your face," or "it is the face." I was hoping that a few searchers were going to grab onto this hint like they did the elbow room hint, but no one did. I thought searchers might be interested because I've been able to match this potential hint to multiple potential solutions, and it fits each potential solution equally well. For those who are dismissing this as a potential hint, realize that Forrest closes out the story with the following words: "With a beaming smile on my face, I exited stage left with the knowledge that victory had been brilliantly snatched from the jaws of defeat." In my opinion, those words reinforce the translation of the lyrics and increase the probability of the potential hint. But this is not about whether O Sole Mio holds a hint. It's about the fact that the potential hint that it might hold can match to multiple solutions in multiple search states. Since not all of those solutions can be correct, one must be careful not to weigh this or any other potential hint too heavily. The extreme malleability of potential hints was what, I believed, was causing searchers to be scattered over the 4 search states. Searchers were basing their solutions on questionable interpretation of hints, or what they thought were hints, rather than the clues in the poem. Forrest's 3 memoirs contain over 580 pages. He wrote over 250 scrapbooks. He answered countless questions over at Mysterious Writings. He was interviewed for radio, television, newspapers, and magazines. And he gave several long talks at New Mexico bookstores. Searchers were concentrating on these thousands of pages of potential hints rather than the 24 lines of the poem. If you look hard enough through those thousands of pages from Forrest, you can force hints to anywhere in the Rocky Mountains, and probably anywhere in the world. Let me repeat it again. This does not apply to every searcher, but I think it probably does apply to most of them. In a way, it was easier to disregard everything Forrest wrote and said except the poem. Even though it was more difficult to match the poem to a search area without the hints, that was still a net positive. Although it was more difficult to match the poem to a search area without the hints, it was also more difficult to make mistakes based on those hints. While the poem could be misinterpreted as well, there were only 24 lines in the poem, so there were only 24 lines where potential misinterpretations could occur. Weak solutions based on misinterpreted hints would be automatically eliminated. The problem with basing a solution on hints is that it was difficult to know for certain whether any given quote from Forrest contained a hint or not. And even if a given quote did contain a hint, it was difficult to know whether you had the correct interpretation of that hint. And even if you did have the correct interpretation of a hint, it was still difficult to know whether you had applied that interpretation correctly. Looking at this situation as an outsider before starting my search, I came to the conclusion that relying on hints to help solve the poem might be worse than if there were no hints at all. The hints were siren songs, tempting searchers down false paths. I was convinced that the only way I would ever find Forrest's hiding spot was that if the poem and a map, and just those two things, led me there. My solution had to stand on its own without the help of a single hint. While the hints might be able to play a part, they would have to be isolated from the poem and from the solution. To be clear, I am not stating that the hints cannot be helpful. Forrest included the hints for the purpose of helping searchers. In fact, I've also made a few videos that include references to hints. My video about Osborne Russell is one example. But for my solution, the hints had to be subordinate to the poem. A solution with support from a million hints, but with a weak interpretation of the poem itself, wasn't worth my consideration. Forrest said that his treasure could be found using just the poem and a map, and that one would walk in confidence when they found it. Those two statements of facts, or constants, were built into my methodology. Any solution that I came up with had to meet those conditions. The methodology that I developed to deal with the hints and to solve Forrest's poem took all of this into account. I'll talk more about that methodology in future videos. Thank you for watching.